Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Dr. Mary Curran, Professor of Practice and Director, Local and Global Partnerships at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. In this episode, Mary discusses the origins of her interest in language education, the relationship of language learning to universal human rights, her work to strengthen connections between higher education and local communities, exchange programs for educators in Mexico and the United States she has developed at Rutgers, the impact of current federal administration policies and practices on immigrant communities, the development of New Jersey's Seal of Biliteracy program and its impact, the content of her forthcoming book, Voices of Transnational Partnerships, how individuals and groups can work to limit the loss of indigenous languages across the globe, an individual who has inspired her work in language education, a key quote that illustrates the importance of language learning as a human right, and her recommendation for advancing language learning in the United States, emphasizing its status as a fundamental human right. It is really a great pleasure for me to be speaking today with a friend and colleague from Rutgers University, Dr. Mary Curran. How are you today, Mary?
I'm doing great. Really happy to be here with you today too, Bill.
So, Mary, you've been involved in language education for many years. Can you tell us how you got involved in it, why you pursued it, and how you think it contributes to the broader goal of being a well-educated citizen?
Okay, yes. This question makes me smile because it makes me remember when I was a very young child learning to read, and we had a toy box with books of children's books at home. And there was one that was in French that I couldn't read. And I just found that fascinating, this idea that there are other languages out there in the world and people who spoke them and spoke and thought and maybe acted differently than I did. And so this was a very early introduction to that idea that there are many ways that our social world can be created, and that in some sense are sort of arbitrary. And there's not just one way to understand the world. So I was really hooked with that. I grew up in a monolingual household, even though as an adult, when I look back, I kind of realized that my mom did use some German that her grandmother had used. But by the time my mother was a child, that language was lost, and the language of all my other ancestors was lost. I studied Spanish in middle school. I majored in Spanish in college, thinking that whatever career I went into, it would be a great thing to be bilingual. I thought I would go to law school focusing on immigrant rights. I probably never have told you that. But however, when I was in Chicago as a young adult, I started teaching adults English as a second language. And that really changed me because learning Spanish and spending time with adults from all around the world really taught me the power of creating networks, diverse networks with people who are different from sort of the white middle-class monolingual world in which I was raised. And maybe I didn't have words for it at the time, but it was this growing global citizenship for me that I began to feel. And Boys, Munzia, and Jackson talk about, the need to understand global issues, connecting with people around the world, and through the English as a second language work I was doing, helped me understand more about issues around the world and how issues in my community affected that. It helped me learn to communicate with others across difference and even understand those multiple perspectives. So hopefully then, as they say in their model, I could begin to act in ethical ways to be able to hopefully make some positive change in the world. So I also think one other thing that for someone like me who grew up in a monolingual context, the power of learning languages really helps us understand the challenges of people in our UXS context who are newcomers here and new to English. So we really, can have empathy with them, understand what it means to learn a new language, and maybe even ways that we can support people who are newer to English and be better hosts for people who are newly arrived here.
Now, you've had a project at Rutgers for many years, a conversation cafe.
Mhm.
I'd like you to talk about that, but also talk about how it is part of an effort to strengthen connections between campus and community.
Right. That has always been very important to me that we strengthen those connections. When I began teaching ESL and when I came to Rutgers University, where I teach now in higher ed, I've just always been struck by the artificiality of the classroom and how we need to break out of those four walls and connect to using language and building relationships with others. So from the beginning in my teaching, I've always worked to design curriculum that would bring us into the community where we could be learning from and with each other's. And especially in terms of language, we could be using it in real context. So in higher ed, we see a real disconnect at times between sort of the theory and the learning in the classroom and the application and practices in our real life and in our communities where we live. We often hear students who come to our university not really knowing much about the community, New Brunswick, for example, where I teach, or saying that they're kind of scared of the community where they live. So we really want to find ways where they can build relationships through community organizations with community members, to change that whole kind of segregation between, university and community. And yes, we created a program called the Conversation Tree Program. There were a couple reasons why. One was really given the linguistic diversity in New Jersey. That's one of the reasons I came to live here too, being fascinated by that. More than a third of our families in New Jersey speak languages other than English, and in New Brunswick, where the campus is, more than 50% of the families speak languages other than English. So we saw there was a community need for language classes, but even a need for language practice. People in the community were saying, I've never had the chance to sit and have someone speak English with me. And then on the other side was the desire that we just spoke about to connect university students to communities. So in classes, we prepare them to be conversation facilitators, where they understand more about community demographics, diasporic flows, and how they've impacted the community, the history. They learn about the language learning process, how to make language comprehensible, and like I said earlier, kind of how to be a good host. So, we know that like intercultural sensitivity grows the more diverse networks we have. So we also want students to reflect on who's in their network and, how they can connect with others and create good neighbors.
But isn't there a larger issue here too? That is the challenge of higher education to establish its relevance.
Exactly. Yes.
So how do you feel that your work with the conversation tree has addressed that?
Yes. We do have that challenge. I think a lot of the students who've participated have said how powerful this experience has been for them to really see the connection between what's happening in a university program and future professions. So I'm at the School of Education. We're thinking about teachers and the diverse groups of families and students that they'll be working with. But also we have a lot of pre-med students, pharmacy students, criminal justice students who are then really thinking about, in my work, I'm going to be working with linguistically and culturally diverse communities. How can I be sensitive? How can I respect the human rights of these groups? How can I treat them with dignity? And part of that, a big part, it has to do with language. And it could mean learning a language, but we're not going to speak the languages of everybody with whom we interact, but if we know how to be sensitive to language difference, if we know how to make what I say comprehensible and not threatening to someone, that really changes interactions. So I think that's one way we're trying to engage in activities that are very relevant to future workplaces.
So turning to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
Mm-hmm.
Article 27 states, and I'm going to quote this, everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. End of quote. So in what ways do you believe language learning or language acquisition is integral to this fundamental human right from the UDHR?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say that I think, language learning is integral to every human right, to everything, because we mediate our lives via language, our thinking, our interactions with others. Right now, you and I are using language. The people listening to us are, it's all being mediated by language. So it's at the core of who we are and our identities. And so if we're not allowed to show up in our languages, in all of our languages, then we're not really able to participate in the cultural life of our community, or the cultural right of our community becomes a singular culture, right? And it's all this sort of assimilationist too. I also know that Article 2 in the Declaration of Human Rights explicitly protects individuals from discrimination of any kind, which includes language. So, that's part of this as well.
Let me give an example of something that happened in this country in the 19th century and into the 20th, actually. It was Indian boarding school policy.
Mm-hmm.
And Native Americans who were sent to Indian boarding schools run by the federal government were unable to speak their language. Now, we have dropped that policy, thankfully, but I want you to talk a little bit more about what the impact is of forcing people to not speak their language and to deny their identity.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And you said it's not happening today. That particular situation is not happening. Yet we do hear stories these days of accents being a factor in who's being detained these days, listening to accents and acting on that. So I do think it's still a lot of it's happening. It is so, to be caught from your language, as I said earlier, it's to be, separated from this sense of self. It also can be a loss of generational connection, where we see kids who are not able then to communicate with parents or grandparents. And so that's a loss of relationship, connection, and sense of heritage. So those are some of the costs there too. And yeah, I mean, it's losing your ability to express yourself, your ability to be fully there. So I feel like it's such a great cost.
I was struck by watching a documentary about the Indian boarding school policies at one time, where a man who was in the school came back to his home on a reservation and was unable to communicate with his elders because they had systematically forced him not to speak his native tongue.
Mm-hmm.
And he was then isolated, even in his own community.
Right. And we hear students at the university talk about this. In the United States, we're really good at, sadly, what we call subtractive bilingualism. We have people come here, they learn English, and they're losing that first language. Why aren't we keeping those languages and having this sort of additive bilingual approach? Because when we do subtract away those languages, people are less than how they started, right? And you're right, students speak about that a lot, not being able to communicate then with grandparents, with parents. That's just tragic. Causes trauma.
Do do you see a pathway away from subtractive bilingualism in the future?
I think that we're trying to raise awareness to 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 not have that happen so much. I do think we see also how do I want to say this? Like as youth grow older, they sometimes want to regain those languages, come back to those languages. And I think there are a lot of efforts to help that. I know you taught Spanish for a while too, and there are Spanish heritage language classes to do just that, make sure that kids who come from that background maintain, sustain, expand their Spanish, and also learn literacy skills in the language. It's not just a language they're speaking at home with family. So there are efforts. It's a tough one. I do think that it requires a lot of conscious effort by families or by individuals to sustain that language. And that puts a lot of burden on an individual instead of a systemic support for that.
So tell us about the exchange programs you've implemented between Rutgers and communities in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. How have these programs advanced intercultural understanding, and how do you demonstrate that?
Yeah, I have to say, my collaborations with Mexico have been one of the most rewarding parts of my work. A long time ago, I had a Fulbright grant in Mexico and kept those relationships strong in my life. And for the past 15 years, I've been bringing students to Yucatan, Mexico. And the goals of those programs, there are many goals, but one is really developing this kind of intercultural understanding. And our program focuses on language, culture, and identity, so that we understand how those are just key factors in the ways we negotiate our identities, and also they create the lenses that we use when we're understanding others. And sometimes people are not even aware that they have a cultural lens and that is mediating our interactions and experiences. So we want to raise that, and then we want to learn from other ways of understanding the world too. One of the other things with the partnerships has been trying to find truly mutually beneficial activities and relationships that we're building over time. And a very important thing for me is we were taking students down to Mexico. In the last 5 years, we were able to bring Mexican partners here. To me, that was a really big outcome. And we're able to now have kind of a mirrored experience. And the students truly are learning not only from their exchange, but watching the experiences of each other. We created a documentary about the experience, and it really shows how we're working both in the United States to help people while they're learning English sustain their mother tongues and their language. And then in Mexico, the region where we're visiting while we're there are a lot of Mayan speakers, but that language is also at risk. And so they're also working to sustain that language identity. So we really have a chance to look back at that. At the core of our partnership, we're working with Crisanto Kumulchan, who is a primary school teacher who's also an expert in the Mayan language. He has a program for youth called Tumben Sasil, which means a new light. And so he's working with the students to see the importance of their Mayan language, to become leaders in the Mayan language. And I do think that leadership development might be one of the impacts. I think you asked about impact, seeing youth who now are taking a leadership role from young students who are teaching other Mexican students or my students Mayan and the importance of Mayan in their community, or adults who are becoming teachers in Mexico or here, learning more about indigenous languages, how we have to really work hard to keep those alive. And I do have a few other COIL projects that I'm involved in too, in a few other states in Mexico where we focused on the culture of peace, which is a new requirement. There was an educational reform in Mexico requiring a culture of peace class in universities.
It's interesting you bring up the issue of Mayan language.
Mm-hmm.
Mexico has a problematic relationship in terms of its own approach to its indigenous population. So when you have gone to Mexico, how has been the discussion about retaining the Mayan language when Spanish is the dominant language?
Mm-hmm. It's a challenge. You're right. Um, we my partners say how they're seeing the loss, that it's rapid, but there are a lot of groups trying to change it. But it really is at a crisis point. I spoke about the program where we're taking students down and students are coming here. We made it a criteria that students would receive more points on their possibility of getting a scholarship if they're a Mayan speaker. So, we were trying to prioritize candidates who would come from that background and speak the Mayan language. Interestingly, it hasn't been that easy to find those students, or the students would say, well, my mom spoke it or my grandmother spoke it, or I can understand it, but I can't speak it. So we're really trying to work on awareness raising about that. And I mentioned the documentary, I think I mentioned it, that we were just showing. And after we showed the documentary at the Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán, the president of the university, Carlos Estrada, was there. And he stood up afterwards and said how important the work was that we're doing and sustaining the Mayan language. And he said, my grandparents spoke Mayan and I cannot speak Mayan. And afterwards, I went up to him and said how, grateful I was that he was there. And also that his legacy, one of the parts of his legacy could be, making sure that this attention to the Mayan language at the university level could be strong. So we do see people who are doing this and trying to raise the awareness. I was at a conference yesterday run by the Bonner Society, and Claudio Mir, who's someone here who works at the Collaborative for Community Engagement, was talking about the history of New Brunswick. And he gave he gives community walks. But my point is, it's always important to him to begin with a focus on the Lenape people, right? And make sure that they're mentioned. And I know when I teach, I begin there too and use maps of the indigenous languages that were spoken in this area, which sadly have been lost. But Claudio also talked about the Dutch colonies that were here, Hungarian groups that were here, African American community, Puerto Rican, Dominican, and then talked about the Mexican communities in this area, and mentioned that in this part of New Jersey, we have a large population from Oaxaca and Puebla, and that those groups often speak original languages too. So it's something that we can't forget, and we do have to continue to work to sustain them.
I want to link that idea of retaining culture and discussions of how language supports identity to the ongoing effort by the current federal administration to expel undocumented migrants. Now, clearly, this has had a devastating impact on many communities. But I would like you to discuss, how do you see the impact from your own work on families who are in jeopardy?
Yeah. I don't even know where to begin to discuss the impact of these efforts, because we're seeing the pain and the fear among our brothers and sisters in the immigrant community. And it's tragic. We're seeing families being ripped apart. We're hearing about citizens and people with no records being targeted. And, in a school context where my work is focused, we hear about students who are scared to go to school because they're worried that when they come home, their parents may be gone. They may have been deported. We hear about young students whose parents have been deported and they're left without parents to care for them. So, schools need to be protecting all of our students. We know that our students have a constitutional right to a free K-12 public ed. And I've been thinking about this a lot. I think we all have. I'm working with a doctoral student, Amanda Dominguez. She's also a local community organizer at the New Labor organization. And she also talked about, we were talking about this, and she talked about all of what's happening really could be affecting access to education because of what I said, the fear to go, access to healthcare, and then the increased family separations. There is another impact, which we're seeing too, which is the collective actions that are happening in the communities, right? As communities take up a form of resistance. So that is something that should be said too. Like we see pushback, we see marches and lawsuits and community organizing. In terms of what we can do, Amanda and I were discussing this too, and she said, join the movement, get out there, write letters, call legislators, donate, always keep thinking about how to push for something better. She also mentioned how important it is to listen to the community members who are impacted by this and hear what it is they want and need and what's happening to them so that we don't just assume that we know. And I think we have to look at ourselves too, right? Like, are we holding any biases about this? What about our own actions? Are we shopping at places that are somehow complicit in ICE kidnappings? Are we investing, or are our investment portfolios investing in Geo Group or other organizations that are complicit with what's happening with ICE? So it's a lot that we have to keep informed about and know about.
No question about it. Now, you've been involved for some time with the Seal of Biliteracy program here in New Jersey.
Yes.
And that prioritizes, actually recognizes schools that prioritize helping students become bilingual. How do you feel this program advances the idea of language learning and literacy as a human right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the New Jersey State Seal of Biliteracy, it recognizes multilingualism. And first of all, I think that's something that's not always recognized or even visible to people. So this offers a tool to document that. And this documentation of its value and hiding its visibility, that language learning and literacy is a human right, is something that seal can do, because it recognizes the students who come and learn English as well. We do see more people more students who are studying world languages getting the seal, but I think that's kind of changing. We've worked hard so that kids who come and learn English also get recognized, and so that the seal can take this sort of asset approach to the prior knowledge that newcomers are bringing with them in terms of home language and culture. And we mentioned earlier that, we should have protection against assimilation, discrimination, language loss. And so the seal, in a way, can do this. And it promotes that kind of additive multilingualism we were talking about.
So what exactly is the incentive or the encouragement needed to have a school embrace this idea?
The incentive, well, what students end up getting is on their transcripts, it says that they have the seal of biliteracy. The idea is that it would be an added sort of credit to them as they go to apply for colleges or when looking for a job. It's proof of having biliteracy, multilingualism. Yes, we've done some promotional events too, where we've brought in community leaders or people from local hospitals, business executives who've been talking to youngsters about how important it is to maintain that bilingualism. So it documents that. I guess it provides it sort of external documentation.
Well, I would hope that more schools would actually look into this and value it. I mean, in my own experience, when I started teaching in 1974, the school I work at offered 6 languages, including Chinese, which was rare at that time, and Russian, by the way. But though I know the Russian program is no longer there, but I think this is a good way for them to provide incentives for the family, for the student, and the school. And in my view, it's a win-win all around.
That's true. Sadly, we're losing a lot of those language programs. Um, we still have Spanish. I think French programs are struggling. Even some of the Chinese programs are struggling these days. But it is documenting family languages, which is something that is relatively new.
So you are working on a book entitled Voices of Transnational Partnerships, to be published by Bloomsbury. Tell us about the content and the goals you have for the book. What will the reader gain in terms of understanding about these transnational connections?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for asking this question. Before I even talk about my book, I want to mention that it's part of a series on global teacher education coming out of Bloomsbury. And I have to say, the first book in the series is one that you wrote, Bill, The Human Rights Imperative in Teacher Education. You co-edited it actually with Gloria Alter. And so thank you so much for contributing that. So I just want to give a plug for the series, and anyone interested in submitting a proposal for this global teacher education book series can reach out to me. Mine is going to be the fourth in the series, and it is possible that the title may change. I'm not really sure, but I'm focusing on these local global partnerships that I've put at the center of my work. And considering how transnational connections, either in the local community or outside our national boundaries, push us to develop our intercultural competence, as we said earlier. So there are several messages that I hope that will come through loud and clear. And one is this idea of welcoming and becoming a good host in many ways, how we can connect with diverse communities in efforts to learn from and with each other in meaningful long-term ways. I'll be sharing principles and practices that I think guide community engaged practice. So people should be able to leave with some of those and leave with models, so that the book in general will be guidance for those who want to start practicing community engaged education, or maybe already do it but want to consider this criteria that we're sharing.
Now, you know as well as anybody that education doesn't just happen in public school, right?
Mm-hmm.
It happens in the workplace, it happens in community organizations and so forth. So how will what you're going to talk about in the book apply to outside the formal education structure?
Yes, I'm a firm believer in what you just said. Education happens everywhere, and I do think we should be leaving the classroom to connect with all of those places. The guiding principles, some of them talk about like this mutually beneficial activities, right? So thinking about how in any context, what's happening is mutually beneficial. So that leadership development, for example, is happening for everybody who's there, not just for the leader in an organization getting his promotion or her promotion, but how, a kind of lifelong opportunities are there for everyone. That's just like one kind of example. We're looking at how you need to understand histories to do this kind of work. And so that's probably something that doesn't happen all too often in the business world, where someone gets a job at a corporation. Are they looking at the history of the corporation? Are they looking at the history of that industry in terms of equity and social justice, right? So I think the principles could be helpful. And actually, you're giving me a good idea now as I finish up the book to think about making those connections to outside of formal educational contexts, what the takeaways could be.
Well, historically, there have been organizations that have had a global reach, whether it's religious orders, for example, or corporations, or trading partners, whether it's the movement of the people as well. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me you've got a lot of opportunities here to get beyond the, you might say, the traditional network of educators and go beyond that to the broader public who deals with education, but in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think you're right. Thinking about kind of training and human resource work that happens. That's a really great suggestion.
So, one of the most distressing aspects of the 21st century, and it started earlier in the 20th century, is the loss of indigenous languages
Hmm.
around the globe, which is a serious erosion of human rights, not only in Articles 2 and 27, but in many other ways of the UDHR. What efforts do you think civil society should be implementing to limit or reduce the loss of indigenous languages?
Hmm. Yeah, I think we spoke about this a little bit and that need to raise awareness that this is happening, the need to make these languages visible again. I think in some of my collaborative work with Mexico, one of the things that was interesting is we did a COIL project, an online virtual exchange with a university in Durango, Mexico. And we were looking at public art in our communities and sharing presentations back and forth. And the students in the United States were very impressed with how much indigenous original language culture was in mural public artwork in Mexico. And it made them really reflect on here and how we don't see that. And we worked to think about, well, where do we see it? In street names, perhaps, or Piscataway, the neighboring town to me. Like there is indigenous or original languages around us, but I don't think we're that aware of it. So I think we need consciousness raising of where it is and then thinking about how to make sure we don't lose it and sustain it. Our students mentioned this to the students in Mexico, and it made them think about this representation in their community. And then at the same time, they realized that some of the representation wasn't actually representational of the communities from their part of Mexico, or that they have this representation that we don't have in the US, and yet people from these original cultures maybe still receive a lot of stigmatization in their context as well. So they're discriminated against. And so it brought up a lot of awareness. And I think for both groups to be thinking about this and then talking and planning what kind of actions they could take is really important. And I know we're trying to do that, as I mentioned, in the work in Mexico too, with the Mayan language. And one of the things we're doing is documenting the work of Crisanto Kumolchan so that others can see these initiatives, the 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 outcomes, the impacts of it. But I don't
Well, in
have,
the United States, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was just going to say I don't have a good quick answer for that one because this is,
I don't think it's an easy answer. I think it's a complex issue. But for example, people who get out of the East Coast and go to the West, like in New Mexico
mhm,
or to Hawaii, will find that those are officially bilingual states by state law.
mhm,
And I was always struck when we go to New Mexico about the prominence of Native culture and
right.
in Hawaii as well. But you're right that if you go to other parts of the United States, particularly those on the East Coast, where there has not been a large Native presence for some time, uh, that invisibility problem is there. I think it's better than it was, but still, it's far less than it should be. There's a much lower level of understanding.
Hmm. Yeah, and we hear people do land acknowledgements, and sometimes people say, "Well, why are people doing that?" They may not see why that is so important, just for that visibility, for the remembrance, for the acknowledgement of the history, and keeping that alive today.
And it's even more important right now with a federal government that seeks uh, energetically to try to erase it
Exactly.
through policies that are being implemented by the Interior Department and by the Education Department.
Mm-hmm.
But let's move on to the last few questions, which are, I ask these of every person we interview, but I modify them a little bit for you because of your focus on language education. So, who would be the most influential role model for your work in the field of language education? That could be someone alive today or someone from the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for making me think about this question because I spent some time thinking because I knew you would ask it. Um, I have to say that I think one of the most influential role models for my work is the educator, the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. I remember learning about his work and how it really it changed the way I thought about education. You know, his ideas that knowledge, learning, gaining knowledge requires critical literacy and critical thinking skills, like developing those.
Mm.
So, you know, he has that famous line that's often quoted that it's, you know, what we need to do is learn to read the world, like reading the world and reading the word when we develop literacy skills. And so that learning is reading everything around us all the time and understanding how power and, you know, legacies of power affect how we understand what's around us. And also, he had this idea of education coming from the very communities and the adults that he was focusing on that were learning literacy skills. So he had a strong recognition of their existing knowledge, how important that was for learning, how learning isn't like unidirectional from the teacher to the learner, but it's co-constructed and really comes from the learner. And so in a way, that was my first exposure to what maybe we call an asset-based approach to learning and how we in education sadly often have taken a deficit approach and looked at what's missing. I think that happens a lot in language education. Kids, sometimes they'll say kids don't have language and they need to learn English. Well, they have language, they may not have English, and they're going to end up multilingual, they're going to have more. And so it really changes that view. But I remember reading his work and learning about his work, and that was very powerful to me.
So, what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of language learning as a human right?
Hmm. Gloria Anzaldúa wrote a book called Borderlands in 1987. The quote's very simple. It's, I am my language. I am my language. And so, you know, it gets back to what we said in the beginning about identity and, you know, you can't separate me from my language. And she also says, until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. And so we need to center this belief of importance of language. And, you know, how can you have dignity if, you know, you can't have pride in yourself and if you can't have pride in your language? So I just don't see it as separate from who we are as people. I just see it as integral.
And so, if you had the power to make one critical change in the US or globally to advance language learning as a human right, what would you recommend?
If I had that power, that would be something. I think I think that we have such a mixed up view about multilingualism. Like what I'd like to be able to do is find a way that multilingualism would be valued. The same way our society values other things, like having an advanced degree from a prestigious school or a high salary or having a nice home and a car, you know, or even, you know, something that could be sort of superficial, but we value beauty as a society, right? Or sports. These days, we're all talking about sports, right? Sports ability. Why aren't we valuing multilingualism? So I'm not sure exactly how to make that change, but that, you know, that would be what I would love to see. Like, so, you know, you would get that, wow, you're multilingual? I think some people do say, oh, I wish I'd learned another language. I wish I were multilingual, but I don't see people actively pursuing it to the degree that they're doing workouts at the health club, right? So I don't know. I do think that something is happening a little bit, and maybe this is naive because it's happening to me, but I know a lot of us are watching streaming programs, from Netflix and other places, and I feel like we're getting access to shows from around the world, and we're hearing other languages more often. We're watching shows with subtitles, which I know the rest of the world often does. So I think that that's a change, but I really would love if that value could change. And one of the th acts maybe would be requiring bilingual education for everyone in the US. I'm thinking of the US context now. That that would could make a big change. Given where we are right now as a nation, I can only imagine the pushback to that. But I think that other nations do this, other people grow up, bilingual, trilingual, speaking many languages, and why, as a nation, is it something we're not good at? I don't understand that. But I do think it has to do with how we value it.
So would a possible strategy be to require that all public school teachers for certification have to be multilingual?
Mm. Well, that certainly would help. And I know that that happens other places. We have a shortage of teacher candidates right now. And so I can only imagine the impact on our field. But then if university degrees are requiring facility, right, fluency in a language, that would be fantastic because that even those requirements have been eroded. And then, of course, there's like trickle down to then what happens in K-12 education. But yes, if it could be required, that would be fantastic.
Well, it's interesting because, when we've asked this question, a lot of people talk about the idea of certifying educators and that you'd have to make it a certification requirement to do that. Of course, that deals with a big bureaucratic challenge because in the United States, we don't have a centralized education department. We have 50 of them. And that would be something that would have to be done. But again, why not? Let's get out there and try it. There's nothing to lose for trying, right?
It's true. And, there are licenses for police and for social workers and for doctors. And, if everybody needed to do it, it would be fantastic. Yeah.
Like the other day, I went to the doctor for a checkup, and the woman in front of me was a young woman with a baby. Well, she hardly spoke any English, and the receptionist sent her to the next person in the building, in the next window, who was from Ecuador, who spoke Spanish fluently. And it's clear that social services that deal with the public have to address the issue.
Right.
Otherwise, they're not going to be able to do the service.
That's true. We've worked with local hospitals to provide some professional development to nurses and others. We're not teaching language, but we're actually talking more about strategies to communicate with people who don't speak the language you speak, which is, I think we all become more sensitive to that as we learn new languages. The monolingual mindset is limiting in that regards because people don't have the experience. They're not able to put themselves in the shoes, perhaps, of someone who's new to that language. And I think some people think, well, it's English. How hard can that be? But until you go about learning a new language, you gain that empathy and understanding. So, but I love the idea of requiring it, certifying it. I know so many of my colleagues at the university would agree too.
So just to conclude, this is a question about legacy and where you see the programs at Rutgers going down the road. Do you feel that when you leave and move on, there will be someone to carry the torch that you've been carrying for so many years?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. It makes me happy because I do think there are people who can carry the torch. I think it was very lonely when I began and I was doing community engaged work, and it was seen as something that was really important and nice, but wasn't going to get me tenure, wasn't going to get me, It wasn't connected to the usual rewards at the university system. But I see young faculty members come in, and I would say most of them have a community engaged perspective, which is gratifying, right? To see, wow, this is a big change. At our Rutgers Graduate School of Education, every teacher now is required to take a class in their last semester of their master's and licensure program called Students, Communities, and Social Justice. And that there's several different possibilities for that class, but they're all community engaged. And so many professors are working to get outside the classroom, connect with community, have us learning from and with each other. So I do feel hopeful about that.
Well, that's great. And today, Mary, we've had not only a wonderful conversation, but I think a very positive one about the future. And I know that whatever you pursue, once you decide to move on, there's going to be a tremendous legacy there that people will carry on.
Well, thank you for saying that. And thank you for your time, Bill.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hins, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.